Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of the Woke Bros. Of course, I'm your co-host, Big Wos, and I'm joined back again like he never left. Nando Vila, what's going on, bro?
How's it going, man? Good to be here.
Fantastic. We celebrated a birthday of yours not too
Yeah,
long ago. That was a great time out in what's it called? La Quinata?
La Cañada, dude.
La
That's
Quinata,
yeah,
which I'd never
the
been to
burbs
in
of
my life.
Pasadena.
Oh
Yeah,
my
the burbs of
goodness.
Pasadena.
It
If you ever
is.
go back there for any other reason other than like just going back to that house, I'd be really shocked.
Yeah, it's never gonna happen.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's never gonna happen. I used to think Encino was the burbs. It's just not.
yeah.
Like
This is the burbs.
if you go over there, I was like, wow, like this is suburban right here. This is
Yeah,
white picket fence, American dream type of
yeah.
situation. But yeah, we had a great time, you know what I mean? Great grub, swimming, great wine, just an incredible time for your birthday.
Hell yeah, hell yeah.
Yeah, on today's show, we want to get into the Senate race. I had Jess Burbank from TYT Rebel HQ up here last week in your stead. We were supposed to get into the Senate race, but
Mhm.
we got into all kinds of other stuff. And so we didn't. So I figured we'd give the people a sort of like just a quick overview of the important sort of swing races that are going on right now. Just a couple of them, just to pick them out.
Yeah,
But first, man, what I wanted to talk to you about was two articles I read today, actually this morning. One was in Jacobin Mag, where they're talking about, polls are showing that the economy is essentially all they care about: economy, inflation, how they're going to pay for groceries and rent and all of these ridiculous increases, and how the Dems are essentially ignoring this fact,
yeah,
and not just cynically because they're ostensibly in control and these things are happening under their watches, but some substantive reasons as to why they're not, and the things that they've decided to make their messaging. And then of course I read in the New York Times that Procter and Gamble and Nestle, they're reporting great profits. They're like, look, people aren't buying as much, but our price gouging and price hikes are such that we've maintained, our
yeah,
profit range, right? Like the range of profit that we're used to, essentially, which means that everybody else feels the pain except for major corporations. Like
yeah,
we all will bear the brunt of, the after effects of the pandemic, inflation, etc. We'll all feel that pain at the pump, in our rent prices, at the grocery store, etc. But big business, no. Ooh, we too big to fail, baby.
yeah.
And I just found that fascinating for a couple of reasons, right? I was listening to This Is Revolution this morning, as I was working out. And shouts to our brothers over there, my man Gene Bajlan, Pascal Robert, Jason Miles, all my dogs over there. And they had Derek Davison of American
Yeah.
Prestige, friends of the show. That's damn near our brother podcast, right? And they were talking about the Saudis and sort of U.S. foreign policy. And I thought Gene brought up, and Pascal both had the point about, the sort of Democrats' shtick right now is this kick about democracy and saving democracy, and the Putin is an enemy of democracy, and we got to preserve liberal democracy all over the world, and that's why you got to put a Ukraine flag up, and that's
Yeah.
why we got to fund the military to the tune of 40 billion bucks, and democracy. And it got me to thinking, honestly, Nando. I'm like, well, democracy in a country that's two-party rule monopoly. If you even want to even think about getting into a House race, don't even think about getting into a Senate race where you got to raise like in certain states it's like $100 million. Like that's about as anti-democratic as it gets, right? And
Yep.
this money that you're raising isn't individual citizens, like some popular support that you're getting. You're raising it from corporate actors, right, who have an outsized influence on our democracy, right? And like this democracy that they're fighting for and they're standing up for is like, it's really not all that democratic. Like I'd love to hear them at least acknowledge this shit, right? How just anti-democratic so much of our system is. But whatever. Like I just thought about like the shit that the Dems are going with, which is like, they're coming to take your abortion away, which again we think is important. People should have access to abortion, and we got to protect the democracy and the voting and the this and vote, as Obama would say, vote. You don't like
Don't
how
boo,
it's
vote.
going? Vote,
Don't boo,
vote.
vote.
Don't boo, vote. All of the patronizing that these cats do. And then, you realize that like the things that people care about, they're not even running on.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's remarkable because it's happening in the midst of this inflation that you mentioned in the beginning. Because it is true that they're not running on stopping the inflation. They're not running on the economy because mostly they're on board with the Federal Reserve's policy of essentially purposefully engineering a recession, which is going to be disastrous for not just for the millions of working people who are going to be affected by it, but also the Democrats, because if it happens under their watch, they get blamed for it. This really hasn't happened. The sort of Federal Reserve induced recession hasn't happened since in 40 years, since the Volcker shock of the late 1970s, again under a Democratic president, which led to basically an entire decade of Republican dominance in politics.
Well, why would the Democrats want to avoid that?
Who knows? But they're not running on that because they're basically on board as that the only thing that they can do with this inflation is to induce a recession, which is ridiculous, and it's counterproductive and stupid. And yeah, they're running on these kind of high-minded ideals at a moment when people are feeling the pinch in their wallet, and that's just kind of a recipe for disaster. I mean, the only saving grace is the Republicans are just, psychotic, frothing at the mouth reactionaries, which are also very unpopular.
Yeah.
So it's the only reason why the Democrats even have a prayer in this election. Like this should be an absolute wave election,
Bloodbath. Yeah.
Just given the economic.
And by the way, it might prove to still be that.
They still. I think it's still like over 50% that they lose. I'm just saying that it should be that they should be losing big given the economic situation of the vast majority of people. But yeah, I mean, it's this. I don't think people realize just how reckless the Federal Reserve's policy is, because this is the first time this is really being tried in a globalized economy. Like ever since globalization really kicked in the 90s, and now has just like fully taken, capital is just fully integrated into a global system. We don't really know how this is going to behave. And it just belies the lack of imagination and the lack of politics that exists, not just here, but really all over the Western world, in that's our only solution to inflation, rather than figuring out how to stop it at the root, which, by the way, it's largely driven by supply chain issues as a result of COVID and the war in Ukraine. There's obviously no talk of stopping the war in Ukraine. We're just fueling it as much as we can.
Now Ukraine's going to win it, so we're already backing the winning side.
We're gonna be at this for 10 years.
Oh my God,
energy prices are fucking soaring in Europe. Like I think in Spain, it's like, I mean, it's crazy. Like how people are, getting pinched just by the energy prices because the gas from Russia is getting cut off, and then they're looking for other sources of energy, driving energy prices up everywhere. It's clearly driven by the war in Ukraine. So just inducing a recession in the midst of that seems crazy. There is a solution that used to happen back in the day, like in the middle of the 20th century, when this country had large unions. Is basically what would happen is like politicians would sit down at a table with the union leaders and like the representatives from like the business associations, and we're like, okay, let's just work it out. Like what negotiation can we live with on a price fixing, essentially? Like let's fix the prices for energy, let's fix the prices for food, let's fix and like it was like this, the unionized sectors representing, i.e. like regular people, like they're workers, but also just generally the American public. just sitting at a table and hashing it out. They used to call it like beer summits or something like that, like what Obama did with the cop and Henry Louis Gates.
Yeah,
they
that's what
literally
that's
used to.
it was called, the beer summit.
Yeah, they would just
Probably the
they would
dumbest thing
literally.
I've ever heard, but yes, the beer summit.
Yeah, they would just sit down at the table and fix the prices instead of just like raising interest rates, inducing a recession, throwing millions of people out of work, um, getting another million people like just very like much more precarious. And yeah, so it's a bad situation, and the Democrats are just doing nothing to stop it.
Man, and just so our listeners can understand like the logic of the Federal Reserve, right? Like the Fed chairman, he comes out, what's his fucking name? Powell,
Jerome
who
Powell
was
sounds like a black
appointed.
guy, but he's a white guy. Yeah,
Yeah, sounds that's a black name. That's a classic.
yeah,
That's a
Jerome Powell.
classic
Like, did he play in
black
like the
name.
NFL in the like in 1980s? Yeah,
It's like the opposite of the Celtics' new coach, Joe Mazzulla, which is
right.
like, wait, that's not a Goomba from Bensonhurst? That's crazy. Um, like he Powell came out and said, "Yo, workers are feeling the squeeze of price increases of all over the place. Wage increase has not met the rate of inflation, right? Like he says that, like, because remember they were talking all this shit about how workers are making so much and it's fucking up the economy and that's what's causing the inflation. And he's like, well, no, actually, their wages aren't even at the rate of inflation right now. Like workers are getting their asses kicked. So they recognize that's already happening. And essentially the idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nando, is that they put enough people out of work, thereby making their less customers for these goods, and that being the thing that drives the prices down.
It
Like,
drives everything down. It drives wages down, because when you have more people out of work, there's less, there's more, there's more supply of
scarcity
labor.
of the work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So you drive wages down. You basically you raise interest rates, which makes it harder to borrow money, which makes it harder for businesses to invest in things, to buy goods, to whatever. Um, so it reduces economic activity. People buy fewer cars. People buy fewer houses. People buy fewer things. Like when you can't borrow, you just buy less shit. And businesses also like invest in less shit, produce less shit because it's just the cost of money is higher. So you reduce economic activity, you slow down the economy, you tick up unemployment, and that should bring prices down. The problem is that that's really like just causing a lot of suffering just to bring prices down instead of instituting some negotiated price control system, right? Which you just like literally just you eat it out of the profits, right? You just kind of say like, okay, you have to reduce the profits, and we make the workers whole, and that usually comes out of some, again, under mid 20th century capitalism. It usually came out of a tripartite negotiation between employers, employees, and then the state kind of mediating in the middle. So that's basically what it is. The problem is that like the Federal Reserve is saying like, oh, we'll just uptick inflation to like 4.4% or whatever by increasing interest rates by 1 or 2% or whatever they're doing, and like as if that was like a chemistry experiment. You know what I mean? But it's not. They don't fucking know. Like they could just like skyrocket unemployment to like
Yeah.
8%, and then I was like, ah, they're like, what the fuck? Like
Yeah.
it's not like a exact science in that way. Especially, like I said, this is the first time they're trying it under a fully globalized economy. So there's going to be kind of like all kinds of weird after effects they don't understand. The basic trade-off was, like, to understand it kind of in the simplest terms, right, is when there's inflation, every worker suffers, like everybody suffers, right? When you tick up unemployment by a few percentage points, maybe like 2 out of every 20 people will get fired, and those people will suffer, but the other 18 will be slightly better. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like you're just, if that's like the grim trade-off, right? Where you're like, let's just fucking execute 2 people so that
Yeah.
we all just kind of live a little better. You know what I mean? Instead of kind of finding another way to do it. Like I said, that there are, but they're just not politically viable.
And And what you just described, Nando, about mid 20th century government policy to deal with this kind of stuff, to make sure people didn't get completely squeezed by these forces that aren't controlled by people. It's just, kind of forces that happen within the magical market, right? These are just problems that arise in capitalism, like it just is. And again, you're never allowed to talk about this in mainstream culture, media, whatever, and be like, isn't this just a function of capitalism that these fuck ups happen, that the Fed has to step in this way, that isn't this just a byproduct of the system? You're never going to hear anybody say that. But what that's called is, price controlling. The government stepping in and literally controlling the price of goods. And that is an absolute dirty term in today's Democratic Party. You can that's no.
Yeah.
No, Joe Biden, he would never utter those words out of his mouth. Yo, we need to control prices. They just don't. The ideology in the mainstream of the Democratic Party is just unabridged, unabashed, just let them rip and run capitalism.
Yeah. No, and those of us on the left, like socialists, what we want to do is decommodify the vast majority of goods and services that are essential, right? Especially
healthcare,
housing,
school,
and healthcare.
Yeah.
And so the idea being that if those things are publicly run, publicly owned, if we built public housing and most people lived in public housing the way they do in Vienna, Austria, for example, then it becomes much easier to resist those booms and busts of prices. You know what I mean? Housing prices remain relatively stable because the government just kind of owns them and they just kind of set the rents. And if they need more money, then they can tax people to get it. Usually in an ideal world, you tax the wealthiest, right? To claw back that money. You know what I mean? And so that's why we want to decommodify housing, healthcare, essential food, the basics, you know what I mean? Because that will allow people to survive these ups and downs, which inevitably happen from, whatever, natural disaster or, whatever, things happen.
It should happen. Global pandemic, whatever.
Yeah, it should happen. When shit is decommodified, it is easier for the state, especially in an era of advanced computers. I mean, this was always the problem in the early 20th century when these control economies tried to do that, is that there was there wasn't just the computing power to be able to manage these complex economies. These days, I mean, that's one of the books. I think it's Lee Phillips who wrote a book called something like Red Walmart or something, where he posits the idea of Walmart essentially is a centrally planned economy that controls prices. If that was just publicly owned for different goals other than profit,
right?
They have the skills to adjust, on a very quick level.
Walmart, because they can your local grocery store, which could be selling whatever. Walmart's gonna be no, you're not selling it for that price because we're selling it lower than your ass,
right?
And we're gonna put you out of business if you don't meet us at that price, right? And they're big enough to do it for their own ends, but if we could do it to the benefit of the public, and some people might say, well, you're putting that local grocer out of business. Well, maybe you shouldn't be in business where you selling baby formula to folks, man. Maybe that shouldn't be a business, maybe that just shouldn't be a business. Or if it is, it's owned and ran in some kind of profit sharing situation with the government, sort of like the MTA in New York. You know what I'm saying? It's both public and private. And the reason why the MTA can't come out tomorrow and be we charging y'all $6 for fares is because it's co-owned by the government as well, right? And so, at worst, maybe we could do this public-private partnership. But people selling you medical insurance that can't be the wave. And yes, and the reason why the Dems can't come out against Procter and Gamble and motherfucking Nestle, like that New York Times piece suggested, is Because that is the Democratic Party. They are the Democratic Party. Like, these corporations are who make up the brain trust of the party. So the people who are actually causing the problems, people like certain kind of Democrats can just say, it's kind of fucked up that the corporations are just killing it in profits, and the only people feeling any of the pinch are us. Like they don't feel anything. They didn't make any sacrifices. They didn't do any belt tightening. They didn't do any of that. The only people feeling the pain is us. They can't even come out and say, like, these are the people doing it. So here's what we're gonna do about it, because that's ridiculous. You can't. The Democratic Party is not going to do something about the Democratic Party, essentially.
Yeah. It's I mean, it's just great. It's great all around.
It's fantastic. I love when we could just deliver the best news to the audience. And that just, it just took me out because, again, like I said, I've been on this like sort of just wariness of this good versus evil fucking shit that the Dems are always going with. And, yes, I think denying a rape victim abortion is evil. And like, in that case, yes, there's a sort of like, obvious fucked upness about all of that. But like, man, you can't you can't apply this sort of bipolar logic to every single thing, and they just use it to just manipulate cats, where it's just like, yeah, if you don't support Ukraine, this woke war, because this war is woke, don't you know?
Yeah.
Like, if you don't support this woke war, you're an asshole. If OnlyFans doesn't put the Ukraine flag when you're signing in, there's some assholes. You don't want to jag off with some assholes.
The Ukraine stuff, man, is grim. I mean, you're just like, we're just like, plowing, we're just like throwing down the thrusters into the iceberg, and just not even like anyone who tries to consider like maybe we should avoid the iceberg is like smeared as,
well, Nando, don't you want the democracy around the world?
Yeah,
don't you want democracy?
No. I'd rather like just not do nuclear war.
Yeah. How about that? How about we just don't want the war?
Like, maybe we should like
let's work towards stopping the war.
Yeah.
And if the Russians got to win some, so be it. Okay, like that's what happens when you're Ukraine and they're Russia. So be it. The Russians might have to get a win out of this. Yeah. If that means this shit stops and we move on with our lives, then yeah. It's like, well, how would you feel if you were Ukrainian? It's like, bro,
not good. I mean, well, that's the thing is like the real policy should be like investing bajillions of dollars in like, a refugee program that like helps people resettle like if they want, like
that would be fire.
We would never invest in that,
No, bring them to Encino, man.
Yeah, like that what Russia did is a world historic crime. Like, no one's denying that. Is it worth committing suicide over?
No,
like ending humanity.
And again, like, it doesn't help to do this good versus evil rhetoric against the Russians. That's not gonna, like, we need to get to a point where we can negotiate a ceasefire, like a stop to all of this, and be like, yo, like, all right, you guys are dying to have some type of win out of this, and like, all right, Ukraine's just gonna have to eat it, and that's kind of what happens. Like, that's what happens when we do business with any other fucking nation that we decide we want to fuck with. We get our way every single time. It don't matter if it's a dictator that we're getting out of the way or the democratically elected regime. We get our way all the time. Like, other countries are going to have that dominion, especially over a place that's like in their backyard. But the evil Russians, if we don't keep supporting a war against the evil Russians, we're bastards for that. It's ridiculous, And again, it would feel like the Russian-Ukraine thing is a part, but it's not. It's of a piece of the messaging of mainstream Democratic Party, where it's this bullshit about preserving democracy. And it's nothing about like, yo, what are these people gonna do tomorrow when their rent goes up in a way that their job hasn't given them a raise to cover?
Yeah.
Fuck the war in Ukraine got to do with it, But such is life. But I do want to move on to these Senate races, man, because I think
Yeah.
it's fascinating what's happening in Pennsylvania with Fetterman and Dr. Oz. Which again, I have to preface this by saying, like, the idea that the Dems can't just beat Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, which
I
is
mean,
like
I feel
this.
like that one's a little bit of bad luck. I mean, the Fetterman
Yeah,
stroke really
that's
seems to
tough.
be evening it up. Like, because Fetterman was going to destroy him. You
Mm-hmm.
know, he was running a good campaign, but then he fucking went off. Like we can't have nice things. Like Fetterman actually did seem like a kind of, he's not like Bernie in the sense that he's
No,
he's definitely not as
he's not a socialist.
he's not like he's not like a proper socialist the way Bernie is, like a dyed in the
Yeah,
wool. But like, in terms of like a populist kind of left candidate
yeah.
that could kind of break some of this class demobilization that the Democrats are
Mm-hmm.
embarking upon, which is just like abandoning working class voters. Like Fetterman did seem like the guy that could maybe stop that trend and maybe even reverse it. Like, win some working class voters. He performed pretty like relatively well compared to other Democrats in with those voters, and then he just goes off and has a fucking stroke. Like it's just
Worse
bad. That's
luck.
kind of it's bad luck for us. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, but yeah, I mean, it is kind of shocking that there is a chance that Dr. fucking Oz is going to be a senator, like a senator. Like we're not talking about no congressman. Like
Oh my
senators.
God,
Like, there's only
bro.
50 of them.
Bro, senator,
Yeah,
senator, the most hallowed body
yeah.
institution. These people have been smelling their own farts for
Okay,
hundreds of
okay.
years.
Let's imagine Dr. Oz winning the Senate, and he just like saddles over to the Senate cloakroom and meets, like bumps into Tommy Tuberville. Could you imagine him being like, "Hey, yeah, coach, who's
It's just
quarterbacking this,
incredible.
Bill?
It
Coach,
it
like,
who's quarterbacking this bill is hilarious. The idea that either of those two clowns would be trying to do anything legislatively just cracks me up. But yeah, the
yeah,
Fetterman thing is unfortunate because to relate it back to what we were just talking about, it's like this dude was up there talking about these bread and butter issues. And he was doing it in a sort of way. He's not like, just think of your normal, boring,
he's
annoying
not
Democratic.
annoying. Yeah, he's not
He's not
annoying.
Tim Kaine,
Yeah,
right? Like he's just not
he's
that.
not
He's not
Beto O'Rourke.
exactly. He's not. Oh my God, Beto. He's not Beto O'Rourke. Like he's like a normal seeming dude talking about shit that his constituents care about, and he's of the land. He's of the people. And like, man, this guy managed to win the fucking nomination of the Democratic Party in a real important state of Pennsylvania. And
Running against
man,
the National Democrats. Like, they had another guy. The fucking
mhm,
Democratic Party wanted some other guy, some fucking guy. You know what I mean? Like a Tim
some
Kaine ass motherfucker.
some
You know what I
dude,
mean?
some schmuck that was part of the club,
Yeah. And they
essentially.
they did not want him. And again, like I said, like I mean, much has been made about like, oh, there's no successor to Bernie. Bernie's old. Like, oh, AOC, she's like on the cover of Vogue, and like that doesn't seem like the best kind of strategy to like win over
Doesn't.
working class. But you know what I mean? Like, okay, so maybe it's not AOC. Maybe she's too like she comes off as like kind of like a Democrat plus, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
she's coastal and educated and into like I don't know whatever. But like Fetterman did seem like even though like AOC probably is like a socialist, like she probably is like in her heart of hearts, like in her
Mhm.
ideology or whatever. And Fetterman is not, but Fetterman does seem to have the potential to mobilize working class voters the way Barack Obama did. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah.
Which they've been bleeding, since then, since
Since
2008, when Obama won a majority of white working class voters. People forget. You know what I mean?
insane.
Like, which is
Could you even
crazy to think about.
imagine any Democrat doing that tomorrow?
No, no,
It's
no, no.
impossible.
Impossible. So yeah, I mean, he seemed like maybe he's the guy who's gonna, maybe like if he becomes a national politician, he can sort of turn the tide around this kind of class demobilization, which is poison for not just the Democrats, but for the entire kind of political spectrum. Like nothing can be worse than two parties that dominate politics, both of which are kind of split in terms of their class alignment. That like there's rich people in there support Republicans, and there's working class people that support Republicans, and then there's rich people that support Democrats, and
That
working
means
class people
that
that support Democrats.
which means that the only
That means
thing
we're
that will
arguing
ever
about
get done,
bullshit.
exactly, the only thing that will ever get done is rich people shit.
Yeah, well,
Like you did
that's obvious.
the like the
That's obvious. And then the politics, but then all we talk about is bullshit,
yeah.
because pick one or the other, like Republicans or Democrats. Like I'm skeptical that the working class will kind of take over the Republican Party. You know what I mean? Like there's some people, even on the left, like Glenn Greenwald kind of thinks that there's this movement that's going to happen where like there's going to be a class realignment, where like Democrats in the 20th century used to be the party of the working class. Like ever since the sort of early part of the 20th century, and through basically the 1980s and 1990s, the Democrats had a clear strategy to just win over working class voters. They had a majority, dominated Congress and Senate for all those decades, and the Republicans had the bourgeois. That has been just that's over. I'm skeptical that it will actually flip. That the Republicans will become the party of the majority working class,
I mean,
and that the
they just
Democrats will
don't
just
have.
become.
They're not gonna give out enough of the trinkets, man. It's only been so much of this. The religiosity, yes, that works. The I think the cop shit is really working class. Like to be honest, like the cop fucking, yeah, I think that is like super working class. Is like I
just
know
look at everyone you've ever seen with like a Blue Lives Matter sticker on the back of their car. Like it's not a guy driving the fucking Tesla in
no, it's not
on
for
the
the
Upper West
most
Side or
part.
whatever.
I don't know what they're gonna do. I don't know that they got enough trinkets to give out because some of their shit is just so hollow. But who knows, man? They always figure out a way, don't they?
Yeah.
They just always seem to figure out a way to keep the train rolling. Like some of the school stuff where it's like this trans kid shit. Like working class families don't want to hear about that shit, bro. Like, I'm sorry, like people don't want to hear it, but they skew way more conservative on this stuff. That shit is effective with working class families where they're like scaring the shit out of them and saying, like, oh, there's teachers dressing up as cats and like all of this crazy shit. They're eating tuna fish out of a can and shit. All this crazy shit they're feeding. Not to say that, like, oh, all of these non-college educated family type situations are like idiots or whatever. I'm just saying, like, the school fear mongering, the school closing shit, the religiosity, the cop shit, a lot of that speaks to a broad spectrum of working class people. Like, yeah, a lot of black people don't want to hear about cop loving, cop fucking, but a lot of the rest of them do, bro. Like, including Hispanics, bro. Like, a lot of them do be loving cop fucking. So like they're on to something. I just don't know. I think there's a limit to what they can offer.
I mean, there's going to be a rupture at some point, but it could last. I mean, so Matt Karp wrote a really great article for Jacobin several months ago, maybe even a year ago. Like I think everyone should read. It's a long one, but I think everyone.
We had Matt Karp up here. That was a great episode.
And we had him on. He describes what the politics were like in the second half of the 19th century, which is the first Gilded Age, right? Which was remarkably similar to ours in that there was a two-party system and the parties were split amongst working class voters and kind of bourgeois capitalists. So there was like the Democrats were a combination of like Southern planter gentry racists and then Irish workers in the North. You know what I mean? And Italian workers like in New York City. And the Republicans were a combination of black people, poor working class black people, and like railroad tycoons. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it was like nothing got done. Only things that, like you said, benefited the rich. And they just spent all day yelling about bullshit. You know what I mean? Like kind of like what we do now in politics. We spend all day yelling about bullshit instead of just kind of like okay, this is the pie. How are we going to split it up? Like a little bit for you, a little bit for me here. And like, this is like the everlasting fight. And that's what happens in a politics that is class aligned, in which there's two parties, one of which is for the rich, one of which is for the poor. And they fight it out. You know what I mean? That's kind of how politics was in the 20th century. And it's been de-aligned in a way that has made everyone go crazy, and there's going to be a rupture at some point because there's going to be some sort of movement from below. I mean, they're doing everything possible to keep us, medicated and sanitized and entertained and things like that, like kind of keeping us, comfortable as best we can, to avoid that. But eventually that's going to break and there's going to be some sort of rupture from below. But that's going to be hard to predict. It's going to come out of nowhere. We're never going to be able to see it coming. And whether that turns into like a working class Republican Party or a working class Democratic Party or just something else that's even more unstable and scary is just impossible to predict. But that's kind of where we're at right now. We're stuck in this perpetual shouting match in which nothing of substance ever is even discussed, let alone acted upon.
Man, again, more just rosy dispositions from the woke bros. That's our show for today. Make sure you become a Patreon at patreon.com/countthedings. We're upping the content on that thing. A lot of special goodies we got on Patreon these days. So please make sure you support this show by a cup of coffee per month on patreon.com/countthedings. We'll be back next week. Peace out, y'all.